Hello my friends, welcome to my corner. With some directors or filmmakers, it is really love at first sight. I have had that experience many times, but let me tell you, that was not the case with Robert Bresson for me. My first experience of Bresson was actually quite disastrous. I remember I had just discovered art cinema, whatever that means, and I was just voraciously eating and just consuming the films of Truffaut, Fellini, Antonioni, Kurosawa, Ozu, and all of those great filmmakers. So I felt at that point that I was ready for anything. And one day I picked up Diary of a Country Priest. I sat down there in the living room with this huge smile on my face, just this great sense of anticipation, ready to experience this mind-blowing film. And 10 minutes later, I was basically just staring at the little clock that I have below my TV screen. 5 minutes after that, I was just about to have an anxiety attack. And basically, that's how my experience went with Bresson the first time. Now, fast forward many months later, I decided to give him another chance, this time with the film L'Argent, which is his last film, as you may know. I was completely blown away. A completely different experience, and I was just like, okay, this is a vision, right? There's probably a lot more to Bresson than I had initially realized. So I went back and I started watching the other movies like Pickpocket, like Au Hasard Balthazar, and those films just confirmed that idea that, there was definitely more to Bresson than I had initially realized. And at that point, I became a huge fan of him. Let me tell you, if I ever get the chance to make a movie, which I hope I do, that would be fantastic. I am definitely going to use many of the techniques that Bresson employed. Now that I think about it, however, technique is probably not a good word to use in this context, and he probably hates me for doing that, so I'm sorry about that, but you know what I'm talking about, right, when I say technique. So today what I want to do is I want to share with you some ideas on his film Le Diable Probablement, or The Devil Probably, one of his late films. But before we talk about the film itself, let's put things a little bit in context, the way that I usually like to do. So I have seen 10 of Bresson's 13 films. The ones that I'm missing are Les Dames du Bois de Boulogne, The Trial of Joan of Arc, and finally Lancelot of the Lake. So I guess you could say I'm missing the weird ones, you know what I mean? I like to divide his films into two distinct phases, the black and white phase and the color phase. And you may say, Jorge, isn't that rather simplistic to just look at the black and white and the color? It is, my friend, and I am well aware of that, but just to me as a viewer, it really helps me to look at Bresson's films divided into those two categories, even though the categories are not exactly fair and are not exactly great. There's one thing that you could say, and it's that his color films are just as austere in many ways as his black and white films. So there is not much difference there in the way that the filmmaker is treating the subject, but just by merely adding the color, you just make a complete difference in the result. And if you have seen, for example, Bergman's films, and then you get to Cries and Whispers, you know exactly what I mean. It's just the presence of color changes everything. And then there's another thing about the color films, and it has to do with the source or the sources of the material there. We're talking about 5 films, and 3 of those films are based on classics of Russian literature, on Dostoevsky or on Tolstoy. So it's very important. Russian literature is very important in this period of Bresson's work. We have those 3 films, and you could say that The Devil Probably, a 4th film of those, is based or treats Dostoevskian themes. So you see, Russian literature, once again, is really important in this part of his work. Now, the main theme here, this is my idea, right, but this is the main theme, and it's hardly surprising that this is the main theme, is existential despair. So I would say that a familiarity with the ideas of Kierkegaard would help you and just enhance your viewing experience when it comes to Bresson's entire body of work, but specifically of these last films. There are 2 films in this period, A Gentle Creature and 4 Nights of a Dreamer, and they translate stories by Dostoevsky into a French setting. This works perfectly well because Dostoevsky's characters actually live in their own world. Okay, this goes beyond geography. So you can translate them to France, you can translate them to Argentina, and that is perfectly all right. The Devil Probably takes place in the same geographical setting and in the same kind of a state of mind or a state of soul. In this case, we follow a young man by the name of Charles and his friends, and they are basically trying to find a purpose in life, like many young people do, and just having a very difficult time with that because they are witnessing just the deterioration of the world around them. They basically try everything. Okay, they have tried religion, they have tried sex, they have tried activism, psychoanalysis, drugs, everything, and nothing really seems to fill the void for them. That is the kind of problem that we have in this movie. At the beginning of the film, you're going to see that the very start we have two reports from a newspaper of Charles's death. So big spoiler, okay, big spoiler, but Bresson fans totally understand this is not really about the story, and if we know how the story is going to end, that gives us a completely different experience of the events that we witness in the movie. Throughout the movie, he is contemplating suicide, and this is what makes the movie very philosophical. As I was watching it, and seeing this idea, this recurring theme of the possibility of suicide, I thought about Albert Camus, of course, and I wanted to share with you a quote from the beginning of The Myth of Sisyphus. This is something that you have heard before, but just to put it in the context of the movie, this is what Camus says. There is but one truly serious philosophical problem, and that is suicide. Judging whether life is or is not worth living amounts to answering the fundamental question of philosophy. All the rest, whether or not the world has 3 dimensions, whether the mind has 9 or 12 categories, comes afterwards. These are games. One must first answer. This is the kind of existential despair or the kind of existentialist philosophy that you see represented in this movie. And the very big theme here in The Devil probably is the concept of the environment, right? These characters are witnessing the devastation, right? They feel powerless when it comes to the devastation of the environment and the place where we live, right? Our world. They watch films that show the awful effects of the dumping of chemicals, the spraying of pesticides, just the effects of pollution, right? Deforestation. Then there's that awful scene of the beating of the seals with a club and all of those things. And while I was watching that, I was reminded of Philip Ettinger's character in First Reformed, that movie by Paul Schrader, that is kind of a reimagining or rewriting of Ingmar Bergman's Winter Light. And this is hardly surprising too, because Paul Schrader, as you may know, wrote about Bresson in his classic study Transcendental Style in Film. I'm going to share some ideas from that with you in a couple of minutes. So that is basically a connection that we have right there. I mentioned Kierkegaard before. Kierkegaard says that despair is the sickness unto death, and that is actually the title of one of his most famous books. And I wanted to share one of his definitions of despair so that we can also put it in the context of the movie. This is what Kierkegaard says. Despair is exactly a consumption of the self, but an impotent self-consumption not capable of doing what it wants. But what it wants is to consume itself, which it cannot do. And this impotence is a new form of self-consumption, but in which despair is once again incapable of doing what it wants, to consume itself. This is a heightening of despair, or the law for the heightening of despair. This is the hot incitement or the cold fire in despair, this incessantly inward gnawing deeper and deeper in impotent self-consumption. This is also a concept that is really closely tied to the film. And what I like about Bresson and many other filmmakers is that he depicts this type of state of affairs without prescribing easy cures, because there are really no easy cures when it comes to a situation like this. And actually, if you ask Kierkegaard, he would tell you that despair is actually kind of an inherent element of the human condition. We cannot escape it. There is no way out of that. It is part of us because of our very nature. And this idea that we are a synthesis. But that's another topic, maybe for another video or for another time. So the director here, Bresson, what he is concerned with is portraying a state of mind or a state of soul that characterizes the youth. Okay, so he is especially focused on this time period in life. There's one point in the movie when Charles has a conversation with his analyst, with his therapist, and he speaks of the pleasure of despair. So you can see how this is tied to Kierkegaard there too. And another important thing that he says is that he does not want to be useful. So what we have here when he says, I do not want to be useful, and his friends feel the same way, is a rebellion against the idea of pragmatism. This idea according to which everything is a means to an end. Nothing is good in itself, but everything is basically a resource that can be exploited. And that is the problem that we have right here. We feel really in this movie the negative effects of pragmatism. This is what the devil probably is mainly concerned with, if you ask me. Pragmatism, the idea of progress, things like the idea of growth mentality, these are basically the things that produce the disasters that we witness in the movie and that make life so difficult for these characters. Do you remember the film Arrival? This great sci-fi movie, intelligent sci-fi movie by Villeneuve. It is one of my favorite movies ever. And I remember one part in which the characters quote a very well-known saying that goes, "When all you have is a hammer, everything's a nail." That, if you ask me, is pragmatism basically put in a nutshell. This idea, when all you have is a hammer, everything's a nail. Human beings, and this is what the devil probably also depicts, have become tools in themselves. How does the movie show this? In very wonderful ways, okay? For example, look out for shots that mutilate the human body. In many shots, you're just going to see the hands of the characters because human beings have basically been reduced to the activities that they carry out. Another example are shots that in a way decapitate the characters because they are living in a world without a head. And the world without ideas is also a world without ideals. This is a movie that really portrays the effects of the death of ideals in society. After a movie like this one, after The Devil Probably, L'Argent was just the next logical step, if you think about it. And with that one, we have a movie where money itself is the protagonist. There are human beings there, but all they are is like conduits through which money can pass from one hand to the next. The hands become unimportant because the main character, the protagonist of L'Argent, is money. I wanted to say a couple of words about acting. Acting is very important when you discuss Bresson because actually he did not believe in acting. There is no acting in a Bresson film. If you watch a Bresson film and you say, "I love the acting," he would not be happy about that. He did not believe in this, and there's probably just one exception, which is his first movie, Angels of Sin. But after that, he just followed his own poetics of non-acting. And for this, I want to share with you something from Paul Schrader's book on this concept of his approach, Bresson's approach to acting. So Schrader says, Bresson's treatment of actors is remarkably similar to Osu's, and for the same reasons. Both strove to eliminate any expression from the actor's performance. Neither would give the actor hints or explain the emotions that the actor should convey, but would give only precise physical instructions, at what angle to hold the head, when and how far to turn the wrist, and so forth. Both used repeated rehearsals to wear down any ingrained or intractable self-expression, gradually transforming fresh movement into rote action, expressive intonation into bland monotone. So basically the opposite of the approach to acting that other directors have who do not rehearse because they want that fresh expression. I believe Kim Ki-duk was one of the directors who did this, and maybe Tsai Ming Liang. But this is completely the opposite. They rehearsed and rehearsed and rehearsed until the acting was basically dead. And that's what Bresson did with his performers. It is for that reason, and I chose the word performers on purpose. He preferred to work with unknown performers. And sure, you can see Anne Wiazemski in one of his films, Au Hasard Balthazar, and Dominique Sanda in another one, A Gentle Creature, but this was before they became famous and well known. So you can see how that plays right there. His approach to performance is one of the things about Bresson that is going to infuriate many viewers. And I would say this is probably the test as to whether you're a Bresson fan or not. So look out for that and see how you feel about his approach to acting. Something similar also when it comes to the concept of mise en scène. I remember seeing an interview with him. It was not really an interview, but one of those Q&A sessions that they have at the film festivals after the movie is shown. I think you can find this one in the extras of the Criterion Collection release of L'Argent. And at one point somebody raised their hand and asked Bresson, I wanted to ask you about the mise en scène, and he interrupted the person, I believe, and said, there is no mise en scène. And he moved on to the next question. I particularly find this approach refreshing. After so much, artificial acting, I really like the results. Should all films be like this? Probably not, okay, but you know how it is. It takes really all sorts to make cinema. Bottom line here, I think The Devil Probably is an excellent film. I absolutely loved it. And unfortunately, I would say one of the reasons for that is that this film is as relevant as ever. You know, the environmental problem, the issue of despair. This despair, particularly in the youth, you know, this idea of the youth that seems to be looking just desperately for a meaning in life, for a reason to live, and for a purpose, and just having a very hard time with that. If you're new to Bresson, I would say start with Au hasard Balthazar, then maybe try L'Argent. And if you like those two films, then I would say that you're ready for the rest. You know, The Devil Probably is just not his masterpiece. I wouldn't say it's one of his best movies, but I found it to be excellent and I really enjoyed it. I also recommend, if you can find them, that you watch the Russian films, the so-called Russian films. L'Argent, of course, A Gentle Creature, and Four Nights of a Dreamer. They are really quite interesting, and what I like about them is that they are just one more testimony to Dostoevsky's transcendence and to his universality. If you're looking for a copy of The Devil Probably, we have this release right here from Olive Films. There are absolutely no extras, just so you know, and the subtitles are not optional. They are just there. You have to have the subtitles. But, you know, those shortcomings notwithstanding, I was really happy to have a copy of this film, and it really looks very nice. So, you know, I thought it was just wonderful. My next person is going to be Le Dame de Bois de Boulogne, or one of the others that I'm missing, Lancelot of the Lake, or The Trial of Joan of Arc. But before that, I get the feeling that I'm going to be rewatching some of Bresson's other films, probably L'Argent, which I have seen many times, but I just don't get tired of watching that one. So that's basically what's in my future when it comes to the films of Robert Bresson. So those are my 2 cents on The Devil Probably. I hope that you enjoyed the video. If you have any questions, comments, recommendations, recipes, you know that I always like to read them and that I always answer to all of them. Thank you so much for stopping by, and have a wonderful day.